I'm so grateful for the invitation to be here and humbled by the particular invitation to be giving the 64th Augustine lecture here at Villanova, which has such a tradition of Augustine's studies, and a joy to be here with many friends, and also to get to put faces together with names of luminaries. So thank you so very much. So yes, my talk is Augustine's Ecstatic Eudaimonism and the Problem of the Christian Master. Eudaimonism is having something of a moment. This has to do with ongoing theological and philosophical interest in the virtues. But more specifically, it's bound up with the rise of positive psychology. Psychology focused on flourishing rather than on mental illness. Due in large part to generous funding from the John Templeton Foundation, research psychologists have partnered with philosophers over the past several decades to delve into ancient moral philosophy, in particular Aristotle's ethics. They have found resources there for defining and operationalizing the construct, to use the vocabulary of research psychology, that has come to be known as eudaimonic well-being. According to a representative article on positivepsychology.com, eudaimonia refers to a fulfilling life through authentic self-realization, emphasizing living in accordance with one's true values and purpose. It's differentiated from temporary pleasure, and it aims at deeper satisfaction, which is to be found through personal growth and moral virtue. Eudaimonic well-being involves practicing eudaimonic activities, which are said to enhance well-being, leading to a richer and more meaningful life experience. So that's the article on positivepsychology.com. An article in the Journal of Positive Psychology, meanwhile, tells us that eudaimonic well-being is, quote, quality of life derived from the development of a person's best potentials and their application in the fulfillment of personally expressive, self-concordant goals, end quote. Discussions of eudaimonia within the positive psychology movement generally distinguish it from the satisfaction of appetites in the pursuit of pleasure or external goods such as power and wealth. They understand eudaimonia is bound up with living in accordance with the virtues, although they often shy away from any prescriptive account of the virtues. Are a person's true values the values that they truly have, or does one have true values when one rightly values what ought to be valued? Positive psychology clearly inclines toward the former. Perhaps not surprisingly, positive psychologists have understood eudaimonia in ways that align closely with Abraham Maslow's concept of self-actualization in terms of the full realization of one's potential. It's not difficult to see how eudaimonic well-being diverges from ancient understandings of eudaimonia. It's characteristic of Western modernity to be preoccupied with authenticity, with personal self-expression and self-realization. Such a notion of a distinctive self and the full unfolding and expression of which is found a meaningful life is alien to the ancient thought world within which the understanding of eudaimonia as final end of human action took shape. And I think that similar distortions of ancient eudaimonia are woven into many contemporary philosophical and theological defenses of eudaimonism, if in more subtle ways. This modern shift, in turn, has fueled contemporary philosophical critiques of eudaimonism as fundamentally egoistic in character. If egoism is, as Christopher Toner has suggested, the doctrine that an agent does or should take as his primary goal the attainment of what is good for him because it is good for him, and that the agent does or should take the achievement of his own welfare as his primary goal, it's easy to see how eudaimonism, as it is currently being discussed, could be properly considered a form of egoism. The virtues are cultivated and other persons cared for because doing so conduces to the agent's own good. And this has led at least one recent thinker, Nicholas Wolterstorff, to deny that Augustine is Eudaimonist at all, since Wolterstorff takes Eudaimonism to be incapable of a love of neighbor that absorbs the neighbor's sorrows and sufferings regardless of the impact on the agent's well-being. Wolterstorff is not, to be sure, an expert on Augustine, but he is a wise philosopher, and the book on justice in which he developed this argument has been highly influential. Recent debates over the egoistic character of Eudaimonism, particularly when they turn their attention to Augustine, are reminiscent of an earlier generation's wrestling with the charges Anders Nygren brought against Augustinian caritas. Nygren, we may recall, accused Augustine of having forged a false synthesis of agape and eros. Whereas eros is acquisitive desire and longing, which finds value in an object and seeks to possess that value for itself, agape is utterly unselfish. It creates rather than recognizing value. When God is loved as highest good, God is valued only because he satisfies my longing for happiness. This acquisitive love for God must be rejected in favor of allowing God's agape to overwhelm our will and love himself through us, as Nygren put it. Unlike Wolterstorff, Nygren regarded Augustine as a Eudaimonist, but he thought that Christians ought to reject Eudaimonism. In my most recent book, I've argued that the contemporary understanding of Eudaimonism has become so entrenched that we need to distinguish between two forms of Eudaimonism: welfare prior Eudaimonism and goodness prior or ecstatic Eudaimonism. Put most simply, welfare prior Eudaimonism regards the life of virtue as justified precisely because it is good for the agent. Goodness prior Eudaimonism, in contrast, regards the life of virtue as justified ultimately because it is good. Oliver O'Donovan captures the core insight behind goodness prior Eudaimonism, noting that certainly if an object is good and I, the subject, am involved with that object, it is good also for me, by virtue of the fact that I am part of the world in which and for which it exists as a good, but that for me is a mere implication of its goodness. Or as Jesse Cohenhoven has put the point very recently, a life lived in responsiveness to the good has flourishing as a side effect. Ecstatic Eudaimonism pushes back against the sort of separation of erotic and agapic love that Nygren erected and that Augustine scholars reaching as far back as John Burnaby have rightly resisted. God is indeed to be loved as highest good, but love of God is not instrumental to the lover's good. To him who loves God, writes Burnaby, the private interest of the self cannot be the end sought. To love God in order that our love of self may be satisfied is impossible. It is only in loving God that we learn to love both self and other well, as loved by God, rather than as instruments for the satisfaction of our own desires. I don't want to revisit in detail here the argument that I lay out in defense of ecstatic Eudaimonism, or the ways in which I identify its presence within both pagan and Christian forms of thought, including Augustine. What I do want to do is to develop the account that I give there of Augustine's ecstatic Eudaimonism by rooting it more deeply in his Trinitarian account of both divine and human love. And this, of course, also helps to shed light on key differences between pagan and Christian forms of ecstatic Eudaimonism, while continuing to underscore the divide between welfare prior and goodness prior Eudaimonism. But I want to do more than this. I want also to address a recent critique that regards Augustine's theology as thoroughly infected by what Matthew Elia has termed the problem of the master. Elia argues that Augustinian self-love and love of God are problematic not because they are acquisitive and self-interested in some generic way, but because they teach Christians to occupy the position of the master in a symbolic world in which masters are always defined over against slaves, and in which symbolic and literal worlds of slavery interpenetrate in ways that continue to shape the cultural afterlives of slavery to this day. What are we to do with this uncomfortable truth, if indeed it is one? Techniques of distraction from Augustine's support for literal slavery and his active theological deployment of the conceptual resources of slavery are wearing thin, and they come at a high price for our own integrity. But it is also the case that simply discarding Augustine is not a serious possibility for Christian theological reflection. For one thing, while Augustine did have contemporaries who rejected slavery, and rejection was therefore a live option, perfectly pure and untainted resources are nowhere to be found. For another thing, Augustine's influence is so deeply woven into the warp and weft of Christian theology that extracting it is not viable. Yet we do, I believe, face the task of tracing through Augustine's thought the many ways in which his commitment to slavery infects his theologizing, and of identifying the tensions, even contradictions, that this created for him, and the ways in which he lived with these contradictions, so that we might find ways not to live with these contradictions and not to continue to occupy the position of the master. Ultimately, I argue that as far as Eudaimonism is concerned, it is only welfare prior Eudaimonism that occupies the position of the master. This does not get Augustine off the hook, but it does enable us to continue to find nourishment in Augustine for an ecstatic Eudaimonism that refuses to be insulated from the imperative to undo structures of privilege that perpetuate injustice. We can begin to get a sense for the ways in which Augustine's Eudaimonism is bound up with his commitment to both literal and metaphorical slavery by turning to another excellent new book focused on Augustine and slavery, Tony Alimi's Slaves of God. Summing up Augustine's views, Alimi writes, and I'm going to quote a bit extensively here, "So fundamental is the desire to be happy that all people subordinate themselves to whatever they think will bring them happiness. They become slaves of these putative sources of happiness. Religions are social practices that aim at happiness. They come in true and false varieties. Those who practice the true religion return to the faithful service of God. Practitioners of false religions become slaves of the false gods they worship. Atheists locate their happiness elsewhere, pleasure, ambition, discovery. They become slaves of these gods." Thus, Alimi. So happiness is to be found only in obedient slavery to God. And for those who, in a fallen world, find themselves enslaved to human masters, obedience to God requires obedience to these masters as well. If Augustine held that happiness was to be found in obedient acceptance of enslavement, Christians are to understand themselves as slaves. Why then does Elia claim that Christians are taught how to occupy the position of the master? Following Christopher DeWitt, Elia develops this claim by reference to Augustine's three-level cosmology, a cosmology modeled after what Elia terms the master's house. In Sermon 159b, dated to around 404, when Augustine began composing the Trinitate, God is depicted as a righteous master and humans as God's slaves. But there is more. God's human slaves are themselves properly masters over their own passions and over the beasts. When humans achieve this mastery, they thereby reproduce symbolically the Roman household structure in which some slaves could themselves own slaves. When the cosmos is properly ordered, humans are thus in a middle position. Humans are both slaves and masters, but no humans are slaves of other humans. That all is not well, that some humans are enslaved by others, reflects the fact that humans have sought to usurp God's position as master and have, as a result, become enslaved to those very, very passions that they ought to have tamed and controlled. One of the historical results has been human slavery. One might have thought that Augustine had strong scriptural grounds for thinking that Christians, at least, are emancipated from slavery to God. Of course, there are passages such as Romans 6, according to which Christ's followers have been freed from sin and enslaved to God. But Jesus in the Gospel of John declares in his farewell discourse that I do not call you slaves any longer, but I have called you friends. As Alimi suggests, quote, a straightforward reading of Jesus' words to his disciples is that the incarnation makes it possible for humans and God to enjoy the kind of loving friendship that excludes slavery, end quote. This interpretation is reinforced by Galatians 4:1-7, in which God is said to have sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as children, despite being enslaved or no better than enslaved as minors until the fullness of time. While these biblical texts thus set up clear contrast between slavery on the one hand and friendship or sonship on the other, and imply that followers of Christ are no longer considered slaves of God, Augustine resisted this conclusion, particularly in later life. Instead, he arrived at the view that slavery to and friendship with God are compatible. He interpreted scriptural texts that suggested a movement out of slavery on the part of God's friends or God's children as saying rather that Christians are slaves of God by nature and remain slaves of God even as by grace they become children of God. He writes, we must acknowledge our condition. Though sons and daughters through grace, we are still slaves because we are creatures and all creation serves God. While this position seems to fly in the face of Jesus' own words to his disciples, Augustine insisted that friendship with God removed servile fear of God. And only in this very limited sense did divine friendship represent an end to slavery. Why was Augustine so doggedly committed to the permanence of human enslavement to God? Alimi suggests several reasons in the course of his discussion of the issue. First, because human enslavement to God just seemed to Augustine the natural way to express the state of radical human dependence on God as creator. God is a benevolent master whose rule is for the good of his slaves who owe him absolute fidelity and obedience. This master-slave relationship was not due to the fall, but it flowed from creation. Second, because Paul and others in the New Testament epistles call themselves slaves of God or Christ, despite the fact that they are faithful followers of God. Third, for pastoral reasons, even if through grace Christians are now also friends and children of God, they ought to recall that they are still slaves of God in order to avoid pride and presumption. Recalling the fact of their enslavement induces humility, and humility is, after all, the central Augustinian virtue. Attending to humility highlights the fact that slavery shapes Augustine's Christology, too. Augustine often reflected on the kenosis hymn of Philippians 2 with its exaltation of the one who, though equal to God, did not grasp equality but humbled himself and took the form of a slave. Louis Ayres has called this Augustine's panzer text, a tank to be brought onto the battlefield at every turn in defense of theological orthodoxy. Followers of Christ should thus imitate Christ's virtue of humility. And as we've seen, reminding themselves or being reminded by preachers and bishops of their permanent status as slaves was an effective way for the faithful to tamp down pride. The irony here is that the kenosis hymn reveals how humility serves as a path to glory. And it is precisely this that enables faithful Christians, Elia argues, to occupy the position of the master. With his three-level cosmology established, Elia writes, Augustine will again and again envision humility not as a position of unqualified lowliness, but rather as precisely the only way of ascent, the virtue proper to being ordered and restored to position 2, the middle point and center, the one who both rules and is ruled, one who is a master who can command others precisely insofar as he is also a slave who obeys. So humility becomes the surest path to mastery. That's the way, urges Augustine in a sermon, proceed along humility in order to come to eternity. Or again, if you walk along the humble Christ, you will arrive at the exalted Christ. Or yet again, don't go about it the greedy way. Try to do it the godly way, because if you try to do it like that, You will succeed. You see, you will get hold of him through whom all things were made, and with him you will possess all things. Again and again, humility is enjoined on those in positions of privilege and power. Augustine was fond of calling masters to be humble, reminding them that they were just as finite, human, vulnerable as their slaves. But their cultivation of humility operated not to disrupt, but rather to preserve and legitimize their mastery. It did not call into question their enslaving practices. Rather, it gave them the strength to be harsh with their slaves, teaching them proper obedience. It enabled them to live with the contradictions embodied in their lives. What happens when contemporary Augustinians echo Augustine in praising the virtue of humility? Do they too take up the position of the master, cultivating interior attitudes and dispositions that reconcile them with the contradictions of their lives? Do they too, do we, thereby affirm our common, finite, vulnerable humanity with the exploited and dispossessed and under-resourced, while making peace with the structural material realities that perpetuate inequality? That is precisely how humility continues to operate, charges Elia, reinforcing the material power and privilege of the master while denying mastery and mouthing equality. For modern political Augustinians, and Elia names Oliver O'Donovan, Eric Gregory, Robert Dodaro, Charles Matthews, yours truly, along with others, have, according to Elia, framed the core political challenge of this age as that of managing pluralism and living with ambiguity rather than as building social institutions beyond mastery. They have preached, or we have preached, humility and common humanity, but in ways that shore up rather than dismantling structures of oppression. For instance, by echoing Augustinian talk of shared finitude and vulnerability in ways that fail to insist on the need for serious alterations in the social order. How does Augustine's thoroughly Trinitarian account of both divine love and of human love of God give us a fuller grasp of Augustine's ecstatic Eudaimonism? And how might this provide Augustinian resources for refusing the position of the master? I want to explore the very different symbolic thought world that emerges here, while remaining vigilant concerning how it might be tangled up with the symbolic and literal assemblages of slavery. Augustine's homilies on 1 John and on the Gospel of John, preached in 407 together with De Trinitate, begun slightly earlier and largely completed by around 412, are particularly helpful in this regard. In the homilies on 1 John, Augustine develops a theology of creation at the center of which is not God as slave master, but rather God as present throughout and within the world in ways to which the fall has rendered us blind. The epistle begins by speaking of the word of life, which was from the beginning and which has been newly revealed. Augustine thus speaks of Christ as life itself, the Word through whom all things were made. Life itself, he writes, was manifested in the flesh, in order that the reality that can be seen by the heart alone might be seen also by the eyes, in order that it might heal hearts. The Word is a kind of reality that is naturally seen by the heart, but to which we have become blind, becomes in the Incarnation something that is seen by the eyes. The Incarnation thus enables us to see God. And what we are enabled to see is that God has not created from afar, like the divine king of the priestly author of Genesis 1, who issues commands while seated on the heavenly throne, far from the lowly stage on which earthly action unfolds. Rather, the life itself through whom all things were made, the divine word, is present in and with creation. So he writes that God constructs while infused in the world. He constructs while situated everywhere. By his own presence, he governs what he has made. Having willed against God, however, our hearts, through which we formerly saw God, have been wounded, and we are no longer able to perceive the divine presence in the world. When we are enabled by grace to testify to Christ as the presence of the Word, we begin, as Louis Ayres has noted, to grow again in awareness of the presence of God in the creation. Christ is the bridegroom who is made visible in the created order, in order that we might see again with our hearts the Word manifest in that order, such that he who made the sun might be seen by carnal eyes that see the sun. How, though, does Christ's making visible to the eyes the Word of creation transform hearts? What we see in Christ is the nature of love in action. We learn what love is by watching this one who embodies love, by loving enemies that they might become brothers and sisters. Apart from love, Augustine says, it was not necessary for Christ to come. Our inability to see the divine presence in creation is slowly healed through our imitation of Christ. This imitation is no mere matter of external mimicry, but rather of an increasing union with Christ through which Christians grow in knowledge and love of God, participating in the fellowship of Father and Son as we grow into the unity of the body of Christ. For we can't imitate Christ's love without receiving the gift of the Spirit that enables us to participate in the Trinitarian exchange of love. The Father's acts of generating the Son, inspiring the Spirit, who is the communion of Father and Son, are acts of self-offering communion. So, too, the love of God toward humankind is manifested in self-offering. The presence of love within us, as Ayres comments, is most properly the presence of the Spirit. And to show love is to accept the gift of the Spirit, which is to accept the Spirit itself. For this reason, Augustine denies that the wicked can have love even if they can be baptized and prophesy. Since in love is the Holy Spirit, Augustine does not hesitate to affirm with the epistle not just that love is of God, but that love is God. Through having the presence of the Spirit that is of love within us, we are made to the image of God. We are, that is, deified, even as God's love is always prior, always that because and through which we are able to love. Indeed, Augustine affirms in Sermon 23b that God wishes not only to vivify, but also to deify us. God is then a deifying God, deificatorum Deum, and a God-making God, deificum Deum. There is no collapse of divine and human identities here, however, as it is only the uncreated God who makes others into gods. And to be deified is not to be made a little master, but to be taken up into the self-offering energies of love. We encounter here not a slave Christology, but a Christology of self-gift, developed through quite a distinct set of symbols and metaphors for conceptualizing the divine-human relation. The very order of the created world is depicted here as a finite expression of the gifts of self-offering that constitute the divine life. We come to see this order of love as we begin to harmonize with its ways. Our blindness to the intimacy of the divine presence is healed as love is poured into our hearts, empowering us to love enemies as we were loved while we were yet enemies of God. Within this symbolic world, this Christology of self-gift, those who were enemies are made children of God through love, not through flogging. And adoption into the divine life of God is expressed through free and exuberant self-gift, not slavish obedience. This is not a path to mastery, but a path to participation in the life of self-giving love that is the life of God. The relation between master and slave, in contrast, is not one of love, of reciprocal, unstinting self-offering. Even when masters reward slaves for obedience, which they need not and typically do not do, they do not give themselves to their slaves. God is here identified by Augustine with brotherly love, which binds two people together in a relation that seeks union as God and creatures are united by the love that is God. Within this logic of the Christology of self-gift, humility still has a role to play, but it is not that of serving as an indirect path to mastery. Pride relies on self, humility clings to God. Pride seeks life through power, humility discovers true life. The exaltation that is arrived at through humility is not domination, but communion with God, with life itself, and therefore with others. How can this understanding of human participation in the Trinitarian life of love deepen an account of ecstatic eudaimonism? The path that Augustine is describing here is not about self-realization, not about attaining a richer and more meaningful life experience. It is not like welfare prior eudaimonism, focused on securing the highest possible quality of life for oneself. It is a path driven by desire, to be sure, but desire for God, not for the self. This is critical for Augustine since, as Matthew Draver notes, he locates, quote, the power necessary to transform and strengthen his love for God, not in his own desire, but rather in his feeding on and being transformed into Christ, end quote. And since divine love is self-gift, self-offering, what is acquired for the self is precisely this capacity to give freely of oneself in love. This, as many commentators have noted, confounds Nygren's neat separation of acquisitive eros from utterly selfless agape. Just as the divine life is one of both receiving and giving love, so the human loving made possible by the presence of the Spirit is a stretching of the self not for mastery or even for self-possession, but for being capable of receiving and thus also of giving more love. Augustine writes in the tractates on the Epistle of John, "What you long for you do not yet see, but by longing you are made capacious, so that when what you are to see has come, you may be filled. So God, by postponing, stretches the longing, by longing stretches the soul, by stretching makes it capacious." Whereas welfare prior eudaimonism might seek to develop a capacity to love because this promises to enhance the lover's flourishing, ecstatic eudaimonism gives up ownership of the self. As Draver writes, our selfhood is not singularly and absolutely our own, but rather genuinely exists only through the self-giving love of the Trinity. While we might at some early point in the journey of faith value God only because God promises to satisfy our longing for happiness, both that longing and its object are transformed in the process of learning to love God and the world. There is a pedagogy that takes Christians from welfare prior to ecstatic eudaimonism, and Augustine addresses persons at every point of this process of transformation. Our early desires prove impoverished, inadequate. They must be stretched out, enlarged. They must make room for the Spirit, for the life itself of God, which is the life of divine longing. There is thus, for Augustine, as Kyle Hubbard has argued, a self-emptying and a self-forgetfulness that is necessary when we properly love God. While the wicked self seeks goods it can monopolize just for itself, God is not this kind of good, but rather a non-rivalrous public and common good that is loved only in being shared. If the summum bonum, as Burnaby writes, is by its very nature the bonum commune, a good which can be possessed only by being shared, then the desire and pursuit of it can never be the desire and pursuit of a bonum privatum. All rightly ordered loves, including right self-love, are propter deum, made possible by and ordered to God, not to the self. To discover the derivative and dependent character of one's loving on God's loving is to discover God's ontological and teleological priority to the self. This is what it is to learn to love God, not the self and its own happiness, its own welfare as highest good. As Augustine writes in De Doctrina Christiana, we should love ourselves and others on God's account and love God for God's self and love God more than self. Both we and others are to be loved as participating in a goodness beyond ourselves. As Rowan Williams puts it, when I refuse to treat a human subject as a sign of its maker, I take something from its actual ontological complexity and dignity, while at the same time effectively inflating that complexity and indignity to a level that it cannot sustain. Or as Augustine tells his listeners in Sermon 142, God must be loved to the point that for love of him we even forget, as far as this is possible, ourselves. So what exactly is this about turn, he asks. The soul has forgotten itself, but by loving the world. Now let it forget itself, but by loving the architect of the world. I hope that I have mounted something of a persuasive case that Augustine's Christology of self-gift, rooted in the Trinitarian life of love, powerfully articulates the logic of ecstatic rather than of welfare prior eudaimonism, and that it does so without relying on the symbolic world of slavery and of the master's house. But I don't want to overstate my case or suggest that these two symbolic worlds, that of slave Christology and that of the Christology of self-gift, can be neatly disentangled in Augustine's thought. It is in the tractates on the Gospel of John, after all, that Augustine's fullest discussion of the compatibility of slavery and friendship is found. And master-slave logic surfaces in the most unlikely places. Think, for instance, of a passage at the heart of Augustine's discussion in De Trinitate, of God as love, where he writes, "This is the love which unites all the good angels and all the slaves of God in a bond of holiness, conjoins us and them together, and subjoins us to itself. And the more we are cured of the tumor of pride, the fuller we are of love. And if a man is full of love, what is he full of but God?" Here we have an affirmation that the love that is God binds together exalted angels and lowly slaves of God. This is not, as Augustine understands it, a love that frees from slavery. It is rather a love that does not find in differences between freedom and enslavement any barriers to unity, and is therefore capable of preserving that unity. And there are, to be sure, all sorts of differences that should be preserved within the body of Christ. But the difference that is slavery is not finally one of them. There are two final points I want to make before drawing to a close. The first is that we should not be too quick to identify slavery to God with divine domination. Plato in the Laws speaks of slavery to the laws precisely as the only secure way to escape domination. Citizens of the ideal city are unhesitatingly obedient to the law, but they are not dominated by the law. Rather, as Julia Annis explains, ideal laws embody the common nature of reason, which is public and available to all. Because the ideal laws are an embodiment of reason, they can be understood, and obedience to them is a form of freedom that decisively transforms the meaning of slavery. Recall the words of Jesus in the Gospel of John's farewell discourse. "I do not call you slaves any longer because the slave does not know what the master is doing. But I've called you friends because I've made known to you everything that I've heard from my Father." On Augustine's interpretation, as we have seen, Christians remain slaves even as they become friends of God. For Plato, freedom comes from obedience to the law of reason. For Augustine, freedom comes from obedience to the word infused throughout creation, governing and sustaining that creation, and made newly visible in the self-giving character of Christ's transformative love. Obedience to the word is obedience to, and thus participation in, this love. Talk of slavery to God does not then necessarily entail divine domination. Augustine, however, failed to recognize that it was essential to be consistent on this point and to see that non-dominating divine rule delegitimizes rather than sanctions all human enslavement practices. Instead, Augustine repeatedly reached for ugly talk of God's violent punishment of humankind, their whipping for their own benefit and without explanation from birth through death. He did so because he found this to be an interpretation of human suffering that was readily accessible to all Christians, even those not able to grasp how willing obedience to the law of reason or to the love at the heart of creation is true freedom. But here we have no innocent pedagogy leading from divine domination to the free recognition of the law of love. Rather, Augustine's endorsement of slavery to God serves to stabilize the institutions of chattel slavery in which Augustine lived. And it can secure today those who inhabit the position of the master in our own societies. Facing these facts can, we may hope, assist us to avoid replicating it in our own contexts. The second point is that Augustine's Christology of self-gift does not rely on its coherence, does not rely for its coherence on Augustine's slave Christology. The two are deeply entangled in his thought, but they need not be entangled. There are tensions between them. Augustine recognized and wrestled with these tensions, even if he came up with tortured reasoning to reconcile them, or reconcile himself to living with them. We need not, nor need we, appropriate Augustinian reasoning in ways that occupy the position of the master, distracting ourselves from the imperative to change the structural conditions that perpetuate inequality and injustice. Of course, we could twist even Augustine's ecstatic eudaimonism to make it a tool for resting content with the status quo that favors our own privilege and power, preaching a self-emptying, self-forgetful love of God that turns attention away from finite worldly social arrangements and dwells in the ether. But this would be to ignore the fact that Augustine refused an elite spirituality of withdrawal as a failure to grasp the character of the final good. He believed rather that we must, like Christ, be ready to give up our lives for the sake of our neighbors and give up our material possessions for others' sake as a first step in developing a love capable of precisely this kind of solidaristic action. Augustine exhorts those reluctant to live out the love to which they give lip service. What does it have to do with me, perhaps you say? Shall I give my money so that he suffer no distress? If your heart gave you this answer, says Augustine, the love of the Father does not abide in you. As Rowan William notes, it is clear that the love between believers is very much a matter of what is both imperative and possible here and now, in attention to the specific reality of the other. That Augustine, unlike Gregory of Nyssa and Lactantius, lacked the radical imagination to reject the institution of chattel slavery doesn't mean that he held that being filled with the love that is God was justification for resting content with a status quo in which I close my heart to another's anxiety and need, refusing to see how anxiety and need can prevent a person from opening up to the love of God. A closed heart is not a heart in which the love of God abides. My contention, then, is that it is welfare prior eudaimonism, with its preoccupation with self-actualization and securing eudaimonic well-being, that curves us in on ourselves and makes service of others a means to our own richer and more meaningful lives. It is welfare prior eudaimonism, not Augustine's ecstatic eudaimonism, that reinscribes the position of the master in our own time by embracing self-emptying as the surest path to self-fulfillment. Augustine's ecstatic eudaimonism, in contrast, when disentangled from his slave Christology, opens us up to participation in the love of God, through which we come to see the Word, in and through which the world was created, and are taken up into the divine circulation of love, in and through which creation is sustained and cherished, even in the midst of suffering and evil. I began by noting that eudaimonism is having a moment, but that the eudaimonism that is center stage today would not be recognizable to Augustine. How might the research program promoting eudaimonic well-being have looked different had it been driven by Augustinian theological and ethical considerations? And how might it have done this without reoccupying the position of the Christian master? Well, for one thing, positive psychology would have likely looked considerably less positive. It would have had much more to say about suffering, loss, grief, tragedy, and the vanity of self-realization. Augustine, after all, proclaimed that the life of the virtues in this life is a matter of perpetual struggle. This doesn't mean, I think, that it would have perpetuated a psychology focused solely on mental illness and dysfunction. But Augustine's words in Book 19 of The City of God still sting With wondrous vanity, he writes, these philosophers have wished to be happy here and now, and to achieve blessedness by their own efforts. And a great deal of effort has been expended on the project of securing well-being, as opposed to grasping that anything that we are capable of securing is not the well-being that deep down we seek. It's difficult to conceive of a program of psychological research that would point away from itself and its own achievements to the activity of worship. Yet it is worship, finally, to which Augustine invites us. Worship, which has been described as a basic realignment toward God of the intelligence and love dynamic at the core of human identity and existence. Here, self-offering is neither self-denial nor an insidious path to mastery, but entrance into an endlessly abundant communal life of giving and receiving the love that is God. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer, for such a beautifully artful reflection. We have some time for questions if you have questions to offer. I know you do.
Or as we sometimes say, you can disguise your comment as a question.
Can I start us off with a kind of a basic structural question? Well-being prior Eudaimonism, does it have any claim to independent validity, or is it a sense of deterioration of goodness prior Eudaimonism?
What do you mean by independent validity?
I mean, it seems like when you play out the definition, it seems like a vice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so it's not a virtue of a sort that can be corrupted. It's actually the vice, and it looks to me like it's the vice that you get when ecstatic Eudaimonism starts to fall apart, starts to curve into itself.
Yeah, yeah, I like that way of characterizing it. I don't have any reason to think it has independent validity. I'm trying to undermine its apparent validity.
But this is going to be a disaster for the self-help. I'm the positive psychologist.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a major problem that they have tried really hard to understand ancient eudaimonia, and they've tried to transform their program, and they have transformed it to a certain extent.
Yeah.
But I think they're stuck at this point. Are you calling on people?
Yeah.
Okay, you call.
So Ian discussed it, and John.
I was just wondering, in your account of ecstatic and research into ecstatic eudaimonia, does this draw Augustine? Are there possibilities here for a kind of Augustinian engagement with Eastern philosophy and theology? And I ask this because I'm a particular fan of Simone Weil, and I know that she, in the 20th century she saw a lot of attempts to try to transmit, not always well, kind of Eastern spirituality into, or injected into Eastern spirituality into what was perceived as a Western sort of self-centric model. I'm just wondering if you have any.
I think there's a huge possibility there. Absolutely. I mean, the whole, and in a way, what these strands that I'm picking out of Augustine are the ones that are closest to Eastern thought, you could say.
And I guess the only follow-up question I have is did this spirituality of the East help them at all to resist slavery? Meaning like the Eastern account of the forgetfulness of the self, or the kind of the annihilation of the self, even make it any more sort of structurally capable of resisting the domination that we see in the West. I mean, that's maybe a further question, but sort of.
I wish one could make an argument like that. I'm suspicious that it would be possible. There's, yeah. The capacity of the human heart for domination is universal.
It was Jesse, and then Chuck, and then Tony, and then I picked up the other hand up. So.
Thanks so much for the excellent talk, Jennifer. I guess I wanted to maybe ask if you wanted to say anything more about some of the characterization of the participatory Christology that you gave. I think that there's not slavery or domination as you were saying, but it seems like there's still an awful lot of divine, let's say, priority.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wondered if you wanted to say anything more about that. I feel like we need categories in between simple mutuality or pure equality and domination. Like we need some middle ground for the kind of priority that Augustine wants to insist God has to have qua architect.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, there's absolute priority and there's total dependence, right? So, even when he's willing to talk about our deification, that's not about equality at all. We're fundamentally receiving, but it's not abusive. It's not punishing. It's not, and he's just not using that language, right? So if part of it is like, what concepts is he working with? He moves into a different set of concepts. So, I mean, elsewhere I am drawing on some ideas from Eastern theology. I talk about the great wheel of being and the way in which we have the logoi that are anchored in the logos. I find that a very powerful image from Pseudo-Dionysius. It gets picked up by Maximus for thinking, about absolute creaturely dependence on the divine, but not in a way that is hierarchical even, but it's still utter divine priority, utter creaturely dependence. So yeah, I think it'd be helpful if we continue to think. I don't know that there's one magical thing, but maybe we need multiple images to work with.
Chuck?
Yeah, thank you for this beautiful talk. And I wanted to see if I could invite you to expand it kind of from ethics and theological anthropology into kind of semiotics and pedagogy. Your discussion of the ecstatic Eudaimonism focuses on the idea that the core energy of the redeeming of the self is this opening up, this stretching, this expansion, and that counterpoints nicely to what we have of Augustine's most common kind of phenomenological descriptions of sin, which are circularity, the endless repetition of the same, more of the same endlessly, and the wicked walk in the circle from the Psalms. This is like his favorite description of sin in some way. And in a way, I mean, the problem with the fallen is that they don't know how to let language develop. So they don't know how to let their concepts become what they should be rather than what they are. And I wonder if, we've talked about this a little bit, and Tony and I might have a disagreement on this, but I don't think that servos is always properly translated as slave. And I think that actually what Augustine is doing here is what he does with a lot of words, is use a word that is much more semantically large and slowly transform it in his work over time.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to hear if you think that something like that is going on, that the ecstatic Eudaimonism is also in some ways an ecstatic semiotics, that there's a way in which the language itself is being transformed as part and parcel of the selves. Right, yeah, no, I think that's a really helpful suggestion. And I suppose in what I actually say here, I resist that. That is, I say this is not a kind of
pedagogy that leads us from one to the other. But maybe I haven't thought enough about it, because that is precisely what I want to say about all of his happiness talk that can sound really crudely transactional. And, it's all over the place. It's not like you can say, well, he says it in one or two. So, and there I'm very happy to say he's meeting people where they are, and then there's going to be a transformation that takes place, and you have to look at where he's going to really appreciate what's going on here. And so, I think what you're saying is that's happening too in his talk about Servus.
Yeah,
You
none
wanna
of
say
this
more?
is to
Yeah.
say that we have to excuse the language of, or like whitewash the language of slavery here in any way, or his explicit defenses of slavery.
Yeah.
But just to identify this as a dynamic that's common across a number of dimensions of his thinking.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, and just to take it one step further, so for us, when we're stuck in welfare prior Eudaimonism, and we read Augustine on happiness, there will be a tendency for it to just reinforce our welfare prior Eudaimonism, right? And so you could say something similar can happen with the sort of position of the master kind of thing. So it's not that it necessarily functions neutrally for us. We have to be careful in how we read. But yeah, there's something very, very, yeah. Well, let me just say, I would love to have you and Tony have this conversation to see how he would respond to that particular suggestion. And maybe there's time either now or later.
Thanks. I actually, I just had a follow-up to Ian's suggestion about the Eastern tradition maybe giving an anti-slavery tradition read through the East, sort of in this ecstatic or ascetic mode, and that's precisely the argument that Ilaria Ramelli gives in her book Slavery and Social Justice. So that's like one sort of way, But so I think my question, and I should say thank you for the talk. So my question is, so when Augustine gives the model, or one time when Augustine gives the model of God's mastery over humans, it does have this. It starts off with something that's whatever the divine analogy of goodness, prayer, eudaimonism would be. That's what it sounds like to me. So Augustine says, look, you might be worried that God is your master, but take heart. His mastery over you, he's not ruling you for his own benefit. Or he's not ruling you for his own benefit, it's not welfare. He's ruling you for your benefit. Mm-hmm. God couldn't possibly benefit from you. Right? So, and that's what's supposed to, a part of what's supposed to make him a good master. Mm-hmm. So okay, if I put those two pieces together, should I be worried that the benevolence and the domination in God for Augustine need to be linked in this tight way for either part of it to work? And then if I try to draw the analogy to like the human version of goodness prior to eudaimonism, should I be worried that I might then end up reproducing the same dynamic?
That when we are benevolent masters,
the benevolent mastery is even available to us, and so far as imitating God, and actually that's benevolence maybe even requires mastery in some cases, which is what it seems like.
Yeah.
That's the case is true for God.
Well, I mean, I think I want to go back to this, sort of the step where you say, well, this is sort of, God is inhabiting, he is dominating, but he's benevolent, and that's a kind of goodness prior. I mean, I think what I'm trying to suggest, if you follow the sort of Christology of self-gift or the Trinitarian self-gift, that I think you just don't get to domination. And I know your account of domination has centrally to do with accountability. That's why I think that the point about Plato is really helpful, where you see it's reason that we're talking about, obedience to reason. So when you think about God as standing in the place of reason there, there's no unaccountability there. And I think the Gospel of John is helpful in making that case, because it's about this knowledge that you have, your understanding. So it's easy to turn it into what we might think of as an unaccountable master when we're thinking of this like human figure standing there next to us, like who's not giving us an account. And the Platonic move of thinking about reason helps us to get away from that. So that would be the fundamental way in which I'm trying to get away from the benevolent dominator understanding of God. And I think that's true to Augustine, at least that particular symbolic world of Augustine.
Right.
It takes a couple of steps, so, and I'm just wondering if I get to where I'd like to in these steps. So the first thought is, I think one of the appeals of welfare prior Eudaimonism is the thought of a kind of an unqualifiedly good soul. And if that's true, then we would think that the goodness of that soul is easily identifiable with the goodness of the whole. And I think people want
With a good soul, and then you said something else.
of the whole.
Of the whole.
And so, right, if we want, the good for each is the good for all, if everything is kind of set up that way. I don't think this is true, right? I think the fact that Augustine is saying that that he'll talk about our servitude before the fall even, kind of gives the lie to that at least. And I thought that was really compelling. And I think the discussion about dependence is right on the money, right? That tied up in our absolute dependence on God goes along the obedience to God and all these other things that were kind of lead to this talk of servitude. And I wondered if, this I think is the last step, a contrast is helpful between the master-servant or master-slave relationship and the master-disciple relationship, which I think the latter is less problematic, right? And I think is in keeping with your reference to Plato and this kind of understanding that we're trying to develop. But in the end, it seems like Augustine still has worries and qualms about the will, so that reason isn't enough. And I wonder if that's why, in the end, he still sees the kind of master-slave relationship as more applicable, or nonetheless applicable.
Because he's too concerned about the will, the unruliness of the will.
Yeah.
I mean, that seems highly likely. I mean, he certainly is worried about the unruliness of the human will. And I think that is undoubtedly one reason why he does come back again and again to the kind master who is going to punish.
Is the good prior Eudaimonism enough to kind of answer those concerns about the will?
There, I'm not quite sure, and I know what you're
I'm
suggesting.
just wondering if we can say, Augustine, you're worrying too much about the will.
Yeah.
As long as you've got a goodness
Oh.
for Eudaimonism, we can solve this problem.
Oh, well, I mean, I didn't really talk at all about how we become formed in goodness prior Eudaimonism. So it's one thing to kind of clarify what it is. It's another thing to be transformed such that that we truly do love God in this way. I haven't really even tackled that question. So you're right to kind of raise it as an issue.
Yeah, thanks so much for this talk, Jennifer. This is sort of moving beyond the talk, I think, maybe, but I was picking up on Jesse's question about divine priority and participation, and maybe the language we have about that. And you didn't use the language so much of deification, more participation. So as a good Protestant, participation good.
It all depends on what you mean by deification.
So what do you mean by deification? It sounded like very ethical deification, participation in virtue as a kind of God-likeness. But the Eastern, or some caricatured version of the Eastern, and of some Augustinianism, It's almost like an ontological deification, where we will be made with God in such a way, or gods, that we can become friends with God. Never breaking the creature-creator distinction.
Yeah.
But it's not merely ethical participation. There's something more.
But that's still, it still is ethical, the transformation of the self into one who's capable of fuller friendship with God.
It's marked by ethical characteristics, but it has a kind of stronger metaphysical oomph that I'm not sure you want to allow for, at least an Augustinian vision. Not all the patristic authors use the language of deification. They use lots of language of participation around it. Just partly it's kind of bound up with the positive psychology and the revival approach about this, where it kind of emphasizes deification at the potential expense of a kind of ontological, spiritual deification. And I'm not sure which is better for getting at the worldly social arrangements that you're worried about and that these critics of the Augustinian tradition are worried about.
Yeah.
I suspect ethical deification might lend itself towards a program of worldly, social, ethical transformation.
Right.
Whereas the criticism of they and a lot of maybe more Eastern ontological deification, if you want to say that, is that it sort of takes your eye off the ball of this worldly social arrangement.
I mean, that's why it is very interesting that Gregory of Nyssa is the one who blows slavery out of the water, right? I guess I'm wanting to have it all, to hold it all together, and you're asking me to choose, and it seems to me that where Augustine comes, is most helpful on the question of forcing us to address this worldly needs of the neighbor and so on. I mean, that is growing straight out of our encounter with Christ and our our ability to see that this is the Word and this is the light. And so it seems to me that the most mystical, spiritual, transcendent moments then are just linked inextricably to the concrete ethical action. So that in any case is how I was understanding it and narrating it here, which would push back against being forced to make that kind of a choice. So I end with worship, but that's, the whole point has been that I'm not saying that it's turning away from the world. I mean, you've made this point.
It's Matthew 25.
So just to follow on that, it seems to me that you have the beginnings of a response, just even in the term that you have in terms of ecstatic eudaimonism, right? That an ecstatic eudaimonism, that isn't simply a moral ecstasy, right? It's not a willed choice to go beyond. It's a sense that you're constituted by a good that's beyond you, beyond your willing choice, right? In this way, and that I wanted to sort of connect that to Jesse's question about primacy, because it's, again, to follow through on the Trinitarian dimension of what you're talking about, it seems to me that divine priority is the priority of a self-emptying gift.
Yes.
And as soon as you have that, then you have a priority that is nonetheless priority and yet also self-dispossessive.
Yes.
In this way. And then you're in an ontological transformation, right, that can't help but have ethical effects if it's followed.
Perfect. Yes, that in my most lucid moment, that is what I said.
Okay, just want to make sure. Thank you.
I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then there's a lot of discussion afterwards in a more individuated way of asking a question.
Now that you've advertised the reception, everyone's ready.
It was the way that you put it, you kind of thrown everything to a close.
Great. It's just what I want to be known for.
But it was all about self-giving. It was opening it up. That's
right.
not about closing time.
Ecstatic movement to the bar. Yeah. Right.
Well, if you could join me in thanking Jennifer for